As a result of the capture of Nicolás Maduro by the United States, there are many people inside and outside Venezuela who are asking themselves the same questions. What is going to happen now? Who is going to take over power in Colombia? To what extent can Venezuela end up being conditioned by Washington? Well, all of this is what we are going to try to address in today's video. And as always, it is worth making something clear from the beginning. Nobody can predict the future. The scenarios we are going to present are not prophecies, but hypotheses built from the current situation and from how actors usually behave in similar contexts. It is not about being right or wrong, but about understanding which paths are on the table and why. The operation carried out by Delta Force, the elite U.S. unit, has made something evident that we already knew. Power in Venezuela was not concentrated in a single person, but distributed among different actors within the bureaucracy, the army, the PSUV, and along etc. With the removal of Maduro, several possible paths open up for the Caribbean country. I will explain all of this now, but before starting, let me tell you that for many years we have imagined the start of a third world war as a single decisive moment, a great explosion that changes everything at once. But reality is much more uncomfortable. Today, a global war could begin with a series of poorly calculated strategic decisions. A naval blockade that cripples entire economies, an alliance that breaks at a key moment, a regional escalation that no one manages to stop. That is the kind of world we live in now, one where conflicts are persistent. Powers compete on several fronts at the same time, and every move has consequences weeks or months later. And that is precisely the approach of Supremacy World War I, a real-time strategy game set in modern warfare where you do not control only battles, but entire countries, their resources, their alliances, and their ability to survive in an increasingly fragmented global scenario. With the latest officers update, the game also adds a new layer of strategic depth. Your commanders influence how your units behave and how you manage your fronts, allowing you to execute more coordinated maneuvers without turning the game into pay-to-win. In addition, you can play both on PC and on mobile, switching platforms whenever you want and carrying your war room with you at all times. So if you want to experience what it would really be like to lead a country in a modern conflict, I recommend trying Supremacy World War I. Download it now with my link and receive as a welcome gift a seasonal unit valued at $0, available from the start of your game. Here, the winner is not the one who shoots first, but the one who best understands the global board. With that in mind, let's analyze everything that could happen in Venezuela in the coming months. To do so, we have to take into account three elements that have given us a glimpse of what the Trump administration's true intention is with this whole operation. The first key element is the following. Everything points to Trump not seeking a conventional war, nor a prolonged occupation, much less assuming U.S. casualties. The logic of the operation suggests a very specific objective, to demonstrate through actions that the United States retains the ability to intervene surgically, to enter, capture the leader, and leave. A message directed both inward to Venezuela and to the rest of Latin America. A massive invasion is not necessary to alter the balance of power. This connects directly with a second decision. What powerfully draws attention is the fact that Washington did not decapitate the entire Chavista leadership all at once. From a military point of view, it is reasonable to think that they could have gone much further, although assuming much greater risk. In the Maduro operation alone, 150 aircraft were involved. Electronic warfare teams, radars, satellites, special operations teams, and a lot of things that could go wrong. And if carrying out one capture operation already carried a lot of risk, imagine having to carry out 5 at the same time in a coordinated way. In addition, opting for a narrative of extraction rather than a massive decapitation has several advantages. It keeps key figures of the system alive, which opens clear incentives for negotiation. You know, amnesties, licenses, power tensions, etc. Second, it reinforces the idea of a clean and effective operation in which the king is taken down without a bloodbath that would stain the narrative. And finally, it reduces the risk of provoking an instant collapse of the state. The third key element is that Washington is not counting on the opposition to lead the new government. And why is that? On the one hand, Maria Corina Machado remains a figure who does not have all the necessary support. And I'm not the one saying this. Trump himself has said it. In fact, The United States did not trust Maria Corina Machado's popularity among the armed forces, which are ultimately the ones who hold the key to change. On the other hand, directly betting on the opposition carries the risk of reactivating a strong, cohesive, and mobilized Chavista opposition, something the United States probably wants to avoid in an initial phase of transition. Now, yes, based on these conclusions, we are going to build the different scenarios that may arise from now on, from greater to lesser probability. A government tutored by the United States with the continuation of the Chavista apparatus is the most likely scenario. In this scenario, the United States concludes that in the first months it does not need to completely change the regime to achieve its minimum objectives, which are controlling a hypothetical escalation of violence, opening up the oil sector, containing migration, or preventing political change from leading to a civil war. For this scenario, a figure from the Chavista apparatus is needed who understands the administration and has some capacity for international dialogue, but without the political cost that negotiating with Maduro entailed. And today that figure is undoubtedly Delcy Rodriguez. In this scenario, Chavismo does not disappear, but becomes deeply conditioned. The resulting Chavista government would have to maintain the ministries, the bureaucracy, and part of the institutional narrative, but it would operate under red lines imposed by Washington. In this scenario, the United States would maintain pressure without letting things escalate into open conflict, and would open a window of negotiations in which sanction relief would be exchanged for oil licenses for Washington and possibly future free and fair elections. This scenario could become complicated if the Venezuelan armed forces opted to confront the United States directly. Here, the risk is not so much a direct confrontation, but rather an ambiguous loyalty, an army that does not rebel, but also does not fully facilitate the transition, stretching out timelines and increasing the cost of external control by the United States. However, the high military command is aware that an open standoff with Washington could result in a rapid defeat, the decapitation of the military leadership in a Maduro-style operation, and greater forcefulness on the part of the United States. Therefore, the operation to detain Maduro was key, as it has likely instilled fear in the rest of the Chavista leaders and military figures. The second scenario would be that of a government tutored by the United States, counting on figures from the opposition. Here Washington would decide that the cost of maintaining Chavismo within the government apparatus is too high, and would bet on the opposition, led by Maria Corina. The underlying problem is that the Venezuelan opposition remains divided within the country. An opposition government handpicked by the United States would be perceived by Chavista sectors as an external imposition, which could activate civil conflict. Installing a government by decree or supporting a coup without first purging the army and neutralizing Chavista groups greatly increases the risk of a prolonged conflict for the United States. In addition, Donald Trump has made it clear that the scenario in which Maria Corina Machado becomes president of Venezuela does not exist for him, at least for now. However, there is an alternative. The figure of Edmundo Gonzalez. This figure could indeed be used by Trump in this scenario. Despite having been the candidate chosen by Maria Corina Machado, Edmundo is a much less polarizing figure, and is also the person with the greatest democratic legitimacy to govern Venezuela today since he won the 2024 elections in a victory that the United States itself has recognized. Nevertheless, the imposition of a pro-use government without elections in between is a much less likely scenario than the first. The next scenario is that of a technocratic government led by an independent figure that is tutored by the United States, and that involves the dismantling of the Chavista system. In this scenario, Washington assumes that it must change the Chavista system, but also assumes that the opposition will not be a useful tool to do so. The United States would allow a government to govern without relying on the traditional opposition, initiating a process to dismantle the Chavista system, a selective purge of cadres, institutional reforms, a restructuring of security forces, and the loss of party control over the state. This scenario avoids two risks at once. On the one hand, the chaos that a social rupture would provoke, and on the other, the polarization that would be generated by placing the opposition at the forefront. The transition would be presented as technical, temporary, and necessary, while real power would slowly shift away from Chavista networks. The problem with this scenario is that the government that emerges would be politically very weak. In addition, there is no clear leadership figure who could take charge of the government. The government would be backed neither by Chavismo nor by the opposition, and would be seen as a government sustained from outside that represents no Venezuelan. It is undoubtedly a less stable scenario than the previous one, and would also require the use of force to establish it. Another, even less likely scenario would be that of a politically highly fragmented country that ends up as a failed state. If the capture of Maduro causes uncontrolled internal ruptures, power could fragment. Instead of a clear successor, multiple centers of command could appear. We are talking about regional military commanders, Chavista groups, intelligence services, local economic elites, bureaucrats, drug traffickers, turned warlords, and along, etc. In this scenario, there would be no real government, but rather a sum of partial powers. Caracas would lose the ability to effectively command the territory, and the state would begin to function intermittently. Not even with U.S. tutelage could the collapse of the state be avoided, since the apparatuses of state control would not fully function. This is the most dangerous scenario for the population and the most costly for the region. Paradoxically, it is also the scenario that would most justify a prolonged intervention by the United States, even if it is not what Washington initially desires. Faced with the power vacuum, the United States would move from indirect tutelage to direct or semi-direct control of the country. It would not be a classic occupation, but rather a de facto administration of security, critical infrastructure, and strategic sectors, especially the oil sector. The political and human cost of this operation could be enormous, which is why it only appears if all the previous scenarios fail. Despite everything, the message of force sent by the United States, combined with the fatigue of the population, makes us think that this scenario is even less likely than the previous ones, since anyone who makes individual decisions against the United States right now could pay a very high price. Trump's brute force strategy seeks precisely to avoid this scenario, because he knows that it is also the scenario in which Washington would have to put American lives on the table. And finally, we would have the scenario of an immediate electoral process. This would be the most desired scenario by the United States administration if there were truly any interest in creating a democratic Venezuela. But the reality is that this is not the priority. And this is not an opinion. It is an analysis. Also, not all the security conditions currently exist to hold elections with guarantees. But let's think about it. In addition to access to Venezuelan oil, something Donald Trump has explicitly expressed, and the intention to reaffirm through force his hegemony in Latin America. The United States wants above all a stable Venezuela. But here it is worth clarifying what stability is. And sometimes stability does not mean democracy, and just ask the friends of the Persian Gulf. The United States seeks in Venezuela a controllable state that does not generate threats, whether in the form of wars, crime, or migratory flows. In a scenario where there are new elections, the electoral probability would probably take us back to the previous point, an opposition government. In the worst case for the United States, although it is very unlikely, Chavismo, perhaps watered down and embodied in some new profile, could obtain victory and with it political legitimacy. Taking that risk today is absolutely unthinkable for the United States, and its only option would be to ensure the result by influencing the elections, something that would in turn strip the process of legitimacy. It is the most democratic scenario, but also one of the most difficult to execute in the initial phase. In addition, organizing competitive, free, and fair elections would require security, institutional neutrality, and democratic guarantees that do not appear out of nowhere, and today are very difficult to achieve in Venezuela. And before ending the video, we ask ourselves a question. Can Venezuela's allies, Russia, China, and Cuba, influence any of these scenarios? In the short term, it does not seem that any of them want to get involved in this mess. They have enough on their plate with shoring up Iran. In addition, although Moscow and Beijing are forced to denounce the U.S. operation, the precedent is not entirely bad for them either. The United States legitimizes with Venezuela what Russia and China may do in Ukraine and Taiwan. In short, if we compile everything we have analyzed, the conclusion leads us to think that the most likely outcome from now on is that there will be a phase of tutelage, with a Chavista system that does not endanger the stability of the transition, and that will gradually be dismantled from within, with the United States influencing the system and pressuring the legislative apparatus. It is reasonable to think that in the future democratic elections may take place again. But according to our analysis, there is still a long process ahead, and it is not clear which political figures will be able to take part in it. And that's it for today's video. Remember that if everything we have seen today leaves you with the feeling that the world looks more and more like a global chessboard, Supremacy World War III is precisely about that. If you enter through the link in the description, you can play for free on PC or mobile and also get an exclusive seasonal unit valued at $40. Available only for the next 30 days for new players. And if you liked the video, you already know you can leave a like, subscribe, and we'll see each other in future adventures. Other than that, greetings and see you next time. Yeah.